I hear you. But your experience is your experience, right? My experience is my experience. So one of the things that will paralyze us in this conversation is if people don't feel good enough. And that is a lie that is intentionally out there, where you put experts over here in this corner and those who are not experts here in this corner, and only the experts are allowed to talk or engage. And in fact, it will paralyze, and I think the country is paralyzed when talking about race, because at so many points, white people in particular are told not to talk about race, right? Quite literally, right? We grow up hearing, I didn't grow up white, but I grew up hearing from white people that you never talk about politics and religion, right? One of the reasons you don't talk about politics and religion is because both of those systems benefit you, right? And then you wake up 20 years later and do feel like you don't have experience because you've been systematically taught and nudged in one direction or the other not to talk about this thing. So I'm not surprised that we have these really difficult feelings, you know, decades later, because since a kid, you've been told not to talk about it, right? And I think the question now is, will you talk about it? And you're here, which is a good step. Everywhere, and this is going to sound funny, I'm not trying to be funny, but everywhere I have been black, right? So in China, I was black. In India, I was black. In South America, I was black. That experience has been different. But everywhere I've gone, I've always encountered some level of anti-blackness, right? So in South America, when I spoke Spanish, the first assumption was that I was from a poor country, right? So are you from the Dominican, or are you from this place? Are you from that place, right? It's like, oh, I'm actually American. And then, oh, okay, that shifts a little bit. In China, I love China dearly, spent 2.5 years there. Fantastic country. I would live there in the drop of a dime. One of 2 places in the world where I had a banana thrown at me yeah, I was just on a Friday night blowing off some steam at a beer garden in Beijing, and a guy came up and made a monkey face and threw a banana on the table. So that happened. In the States, it's different. I think I live in California. I'm from California, but I've lived in Colorado, Tennessee, Texas, New York, and Boston. In California, it's really interesting, right? Because we're on the left coast. We like to think that we're very progressive and liberal, and in LA in particular, like to buy into the illusion that we don't deal with any racism here. But again, I will always bring you back to the history, namely the Great Migration and the westward expansion, where you had folks who are white folks who are from the American South, and then from Louisiana, Mississippi, in Texas in particular, and moved to Southern California, right? And there was a mass marketing campaign to have folks move from, and in particular, non-landowning, poor white men move from the American South to Southern California to create this new economy. When they got here, they brought all of those experiences and assumptions and prejudices and more, and establish those and infuse those into the systems that we have in California. So quite literally, many of the same systems that we had in the American South exist in California. Folks are always surprised to find out that California had slaves, and that California had slaves for long after emancipation. Folks are always surprised to find out that California, right, the land of liberals, has and had what were called sundown towns, right? So at sundown, if you were black, you were expected to be out of that city. The city where my dad was a cop for 25 years, Glendale, was a sundown town. At sundown, every black person had to be out of Glendale, Burbank, Long Beach. Every municipality in LA had sundown towns, right? And you talk about redlining and covenant laws, where there are huge swaths of land where black people could not buy land in California, right? So that's here. Texas is different. Tennessee also has its history. So there's no place in the US that gets away from the ugliness of race and the systemic ugliness of race. And then California is one of those places where on the outside, Californians look like a duck who's sort of swimming across the surface of the pond, but underneath there are all these systems that keep Black people down and in their place, and quite literally out of certain places. We were in Malibu the other day, just sort of enjoying some time there, and it was quite apparent to me that people there don't have to get their hands dirty because that dirty work was done 4 or 5 generations earlier, right? We walked past a $16 million house, and it's like, oh, how does one buy a $16 million house? You don't. Your great-great-grandfather or your grandfather or your whoever bought it when it was $20,000, $50,000, and it stayed in the family, and through covenant laws was not allowed to be passed on or given to another person, maybe Black people or brown people or anybody else. So then that wealth accumulates and is an exponential function over time, right? And then you're like, why are there no Black people in Malibu? Because when before Malibu and it was founded, we weren't allowed to be there. So it's, yeah. I'll speak for myself. I think friendship is about proximity, right? And what I mean by that is like, how close are we, right? And oftentimes in my experiences, I've felt like my white friends felt like they were closer to me than I felt like to them, right? And in times like these, in real crisis, you find out as a Black person who your friends are, right? And it's been a sort of a whiplash of sorts to have amazing people who I love dearly, who are my friends, who I do anything, quite literally anything for, and have done quite literally anything for, sort of reach out in a way that right now is great, but my question is always, what happened before and then what's going to happen after, right? So George Floyd is one of the many, right? There's 1,000, this is a crazy number. 1,000 people are killed by cops a year. Of all the problems in the world that we can solve, it does not have to be this way. 1,000 people dying by cops is one of the things we don't have to happen. And my question is, where were you before? You're here now, and then where will you be, right? And I think one of the ways of supporting me and other Black people is to tie your boats to their success or failure. And what I mean by that is, are we living lives in such a way that they are so intertwined that my success or my failure is directly correlated to your success or your failure, right? That is, when we talk about the fabric of America, right? Like, it's a fabric of America because all of our success is tied together, right? And it's, can you over time tie that fabric together? And that won't happen in one Zoom call. That won't happen in one conversation. That is the little things that happen every single day, the little check-ins, rain or shine, that really move that needle forward and then build that bond. So that way, when the weight of the crisis hits, that relationship can sustain that weight. Because right now, there are some relationships that I have, nobody on this call, of course, and seriously, nobody here, but there's some relationships where the weight of this crisis has jumped on that relationship and broken through because there wasn't the infrastructural work to sustain that before, right? Where people all of a sudden now say, Black Lives Matter, but like, you're also the same person who said some really crazy stuff in 2016 when I said Black Lives Matter, in 2017 when I said Black Lives Matter, in 2018 when I said Black Lives Matter. Like, you were very quick to say all lives and blue lives in those moments. And now, we're all Black lives because it's trendy, right? And I think that is a difficult piece.